Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Unraveling Politics, a weekly political analysis show. Thank you for joining me today on Memorial Day. While many will call this the first official day of summer, it is also a day to remember the fallen. So please remember that there are many in our country that are grieving relatives at this time. So please keep them in mind. While all of our military veterans and the fallen have given some gave all. So please remember that. Well, it finally happened. Late Wednesday night, the House of Representatives passed Speaker Johnson's tax-cutting bill 215 to 214 in the narrowest majority possible. Two Republicans voted against the bill, and unanimously with the Democrats, and one Republican, I believe, voted present. And President Trump had personally lobbied for this bill. Of course, we don't know what he said, but I imagine that it was a combination of carrots and sticks, telling Republicans that if the bill wasn't passed, they would look like clowns and would be headed for defeat in the midterms. And I assume he would say that this is his agenda, it has to be done, and that's something that I was kind of hinting at. Now, the bill moves on to the Senate, which will almost certainly want to make changes, and the goal of congressional leaders is to pass the bill by the 4th of July. The bill that Speaker Johnson brought up for a vote, according to the Congressional Budget Office, which is nonpartisan, would add $3.8 trillion to the national debt over 10 years. In other words, $380 billion a year, and that's on top of the $2 trillion every year. The bill would boost defense spending, raising it by $150 billion, I assume, per year, pushing 7.6 million people off of Medicaid over 10 years, implementing stricter requirements for SNAP, also known as food stamps, and that would save $300 billion over 10 years. And that there would be work requirements, as I said, for ages 55 to 64, and mostly push these costs down to the states, which I agree with because that should be a state thing, but that's besides the point. From what I understand, the work requirements will come into effect at the end of 2026. They also cut Biden's so-called Inflation Reduction Act tax credits on electric vehicles, and that's not even going to raise that much, a couple $100 billion over 10 years. And if you weren't aware, one of the reasons the bill struggled to pass, along with other than its price tag, was the state and local tax deduction, and also known as the SALT tax. There was a limit, and that limit has been in place since 2018 at $10,000. This bill raises it to $40,000. This means people living in high state and local tax areas can write off their taxes and pay less tax. This is something I am vehemently opposed to. I explained this in the last episode, but it is popular among Republican circles. The biggest thing was the $2 trillion in tax breaks over 10 years. This would also end taxes on tips, overtime, car loan, interest as well. I'm opposed to all these things, as I said. Most people on tips don't pay federal taxes anyway, and no taxes on overtime. That does sound nice, but what if a billionaire decides to set up a contract where they make $7.25 an hour with guaranteed overtime, and that would allow most of their money to be tax-free? This, strangely enough, would also allow $10,000 in car interest, loan interest payments to be deducted if they buy an American vehicle. This also doesn't sound like a good idea to me because we should be discouraging Americans to buy cars on loans. They should be saving up money and buying it in cash. That is what financial experts say, and that is what I am saying. This bill would also expand the child tax credit to $2,500 until 2028, and then it would drop back down to $2,000. This I will support as it's a move to reduce child poverty, but if this bill was not passed, it would go back down to $1,000 per child. There's some other stuff like the Make America Great Again savings account. I didn't see this getting a lot of attention, and I really had to dig into this. It would give parents of children under the age of 8 $1,000 to allow for growth and investment, and parents and other relatives could add $5,000 annually, tax-free until the 18th birthday, where that money could be used for various things. It's kind of like a 529 account, but doesn't have to be used for college. It could be, but it doesn't have to be. Harry Enton on CNN. I know I don't usually watch CNN very often, but I did see this on YouTube, and I thought it was a pretty good explanation. He showed a survey found that 60% of Americans want taxes to be cut, even if that raises the deficit, and 23% said the same back in 1996. Among Republicans, it was 74%, And this is not shocking at all because I've noticed generally people don't care about debt and deficits, and I would suspect that part of this is because the fiscal situation that tens of millions of Americans are in, the cost of living crisis has eaten away at the standard of living of so many Americans, and people blame the government, I think, in part for that, and I would agree with that. And cutting taxes appears to them to be the easiest way to do that. And ultimately, though, like a credit card, you have to pay this back, and at some point that will be due eventually. If you don't believe me, if we spent the 2000s and 2010s, if we had stayed those 20 years not invading countries, we would have brought the debt down to very low levels. And if we had not invaded countries, if we had not had the Bush tax cuts, then that would be the situation that we are in. We spend $1 trillion a year on interest on the debt, and that money is money that's not being spent on social services or the military. We could be spending that money to send people to college, to make healthcare more affordable, to raise the care of veterans, to invest in our infrastructure, lots of different things, and instead we have to pay back on the debt. The bill also raised the debt ceiling, which we are currently expected to hit in August, according to the Treasury Secretary. And the debt ceiling, I don't think I've ever had to explain the debt ceiling, and that I will have to do in another episode, but the debt ceiling definitely needs to be raised. That's something that really we can't be debating about. Congress is going to drag their feet on it. Of course, they always do, but that is really not something we want to mess with. Well, now what? As I said, the Senate needs to pass the bill before it becomes law, and they're going to want their own changes. That's expected. What those changes remain unclear, but Republicans only need 50 out of 100 votes to pass this. It's unlikely the Senate will pass the bill in the current form. Democrats will unanimously vote against it, I'll tell you that right now. This means they can only lose 4 Republican votes, and Rand Paul has already said he will vote against it because it has a provision to raise the debt ceiling. So my suggestion is break the debt ceiling off into a separate bill. That will get Democrat support, at least from the leadership, and then send that bill back to the House. Then deal with the tax cuts. As for the rest of the Senate, they seem to not be thrilled about it. The Republican leader John Thune said Republicans will introduce their own bill. If you're confused or not an American, both chambers have to pass the exact same bill. If either chamber adds a single period or comma to the bill, the other has to approve it. So any changes that Republicans make in the Senate will upset the careful compromise that was made in the House of Representatives. I'm guessing that the Senate version will have less deep cuts, although there are some senators like Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, they want even deeper cuts. From what I gather, most Republicans in the Senate like the tax cuts, are appalled by the spending cuts, yet are also appalled by the deficit. So, contradictory complaints. So I will say this. The Senate is usually the more mature chamber, and that's something that not just I've noticed. Even George Washington told Thomas Jefferson that he expected the Senate would cool the legislation from the House. Kind of like you pour tea into a cup. This is probably a good example of that. So I expect it to be watered down, but remember J.D. Vance as Senate President and Trump himself will have strong influence here. So there's going to be a lot of wrangling over the next few weeks. The Senate will return from Memorial Day break on June the 2nd, which is a week from now, and they'll have a clear runway pretty much from June the 2nd until June 27th with only 2 days off for Juneteenth weekend, and we'll see what happens. I was skeptical this bill would pass, but it did. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Am I overreacting about the debt? Will these tax cuts usher in an age of prosperity as the president promised? Or will nothing really change? Because that is totally possible too. In case you're wondering, the reason Liz Truss, the UK's former prime minister, is on the thumbnail is because she did something very similar to what Trump is proposing. Her administration announced major unfunded tax cuts and completely blew a hole in the UK pension market, the bond market, and crashed the pound. And that is something that I am concerned about if we implement this policy. The very last thing I have to say about tax cuts for this episode, and probably for the next week or two as the Senate considers how to move forward, is that tax cuts are like a credit card. It has to be paid back in the future. This is not like borrowing money to buy a house. That is an investment. Cutting taxes is not an investment. Just like going on vacation is not an investment. It's something you do when you have money to spare, and this country does not have the money to spare. Please let me know, as I said, in your thoughts in the comments down below. As for President Trump's approval, which we've not talked about in quite a while, it's actually risen quite a bit. just outside the margin of error, too. According to Real Clear Politics, the widest was about minus 7.2, and that was back on April 9th. That was when Trump announced his reciprocal tariffs. It now stands at minus 2, and that's a pretty good sign for the president. It gained 5 points in a month, in 2 months. And so why did it narrow a bit? Well, if you look at the Real Clear Politics polling numbers, his approval of immigration has actually risen in the recent weeks, and the economy appears to have gotten a bit better as the tariffs were rolled back. Well, I'll bring up tariffs in a moment. And the other issues have stayed the same or gotten a little bit worse. Considering that those are the top two issues, immigration and the economy, it would explain why the president is in a slightly better position than he was a few weeks ago. As for the direction of the country, I'm actually pretty surprised that 44% of Americans believe we are headed on the right track, while 51% think we are on the wrong track. That's pretty high. I was expecting to be much lower than 44. The last time right track numbers were this high was exactly 4 years ago when President Biden was rolling out the COVID vaccines. And before then, it was in June 2009 when we were recovering from the Great Recession. So the fact that it's actually this high is quite remarkable considering how shaky the global economy has been. For context, it was only 27% on November 5th, which explains why Kamala Harris lost the election, because only 27% of Americans believed we were on the right track. Lastly, as I was putting this episode together, Trump is preparing to launch another trade war with the European Union. Unlike Canada and Mexico, the European Union is a bigger economy than we are. Each individual country is less than us, but combined, the European Union is a much bigger economy. This will have to be next week's episode's topic because we just don't know much about it, other than we are expecting 50% tariffs across the board and 25% tariffs on Apple products. Needless to say, this will send global markets into a tizzy, and they're closed for the holiday weekend in America, and nearly $1 trillion worth of stuff is at risk here. We send about $350 billion worth of stuff there last year, and they sent us about $500 billion. Of course, they didn't send it to us. We bought it. We have $500 billion worth of stuff. So the $500 billion we imported is now at risk of being 50% higher. And the jobs behind the $350 billion of stuff we send over there is at risk. Needless to say, I'm definitely learning why we abandoned tariffs a century ago. 150 years ago, we basically ran the entire federal government on tariffs. The federal government was very tiny back then. It was basically just the military and the post office and Congress. But we eventually moved away from that because we realized it didn't work. And the odd thing here is that Trump said that he was not looking for a deal. Not looking for a deal with the European Union. Then again, Scott Bessent said he was looking for every country to make a deal. So what is it? Do we want a deal or do we not want a deal? They can have it both ways. And this is also a reminder that the tariff situation is not over. The 90-day pause runs out in July. Anyway, that is all I have for this episode. Thank you for listening, and I appreciate it. And I hope to have you back here soon next week, and have a great Memorial Day. Bye-bye.